all over the places. So
Live from Noonan, Georgia, it's Philip Martin.
it doesn't sound very exciting, does it?
No, it doesn't.
So in just a little bit, we will be stepping into a little conversation about looking at some of our prior work, maybe the sermon and teaching work of others, and how to profit well from that. But before we dig into that archive, Terry, how are you doing?
Man, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I got a really simple question for us that it kind of ties into a little bit of some of those things for us today, and I'm going to drop it out for you. It shouldn't be too complicated. Last couple weeks, give me something that's good news. What's some good Francis family news or Chelsea family news? That's just something positive to share with folks to give us a little pick-me-up.
Oh, man. Like, there's so much. Like, how do you just choose one thing? I think that's the...
Make a pick.
I think that's the deal. Like, how do you just pick one? I mean, don't you feel that way? Don't you see a lot of blessings?
There's been a lot of good stuff. I've got two on my list, but I thought I'd let you go through first.
So from the church front, I think one of the cool things is you were still doing hybrid stuff, but the weather's turned. It's been 80 the last couple of Sundays. It's been almost too sunny, believe it or not. It's been beautiful. And our small group got to meet for the first time. We met outside. It was fantastic. I had about 20 people there. It was fun. And, I mean, I've missed that interaction with my brethren on a more open level. And from a family standpoint, man, there's just tons of stuff. My wife has got her second shot and has tests that says that she has all the antibodies for COVID, so she's good to go, at least for the foreseeable future. I got my shot coming next week. Her dad's second shot is next week, so we view that as a blessing. Even if you don't want the shot, at least rejoice with us that we're able to get it. And
Sure.
and brag on my kid, my oldest daughter. I'll just throw this out there. We found out yesterday she is number 10 in the class of over 320 kids, and has balanced that with also being a soccer player pretty much full time. And you know how that is, Phil. And she's starting on her soccer team in high school and has done really good. And so just blessings all around. The youngest is an all-state choir member in Alabama. We just got a lot of good things. Like I said, it's hard to pick one. There's a lot of good stuff going on. And I think that's a great question, though, because we always think about the bad stuff. It's great.
Right. It's just something that's been on my mind. It's just challenging at times to step above the pain or bad experiences or just leave them behind. And so as I kind of step into today's conversation that was on my mind, I thought it'd be good to share a little bit. And it's awesome. I'll kind of echo a couple of those things. Number one, for Eastside, I think we're going on a long streak of no serious weather-related issues for our Sunday assemblies, which have been a
Well, you
mix
just
of
cursed that.
Oh, we've already talked about it. We had some rain. We've had some different stuff, and it'll happen. And even if it does rain, God has blessed the church at Eastside in so many ways over the last year. And so for East Side, I will say it's been abundantly good in many ways. It doesn't mean there's no challenges. It just means there has been much good. On a familial level, on a family level, we got together with brethren out on a picnic on Sunday, and it was just fabulous. We are outdoors, separated, socially, as everyone felt different levels of comfort with. Got to play a little cornhole. Just a pleasant Sunday, first day of the week, engaged in spiritual things, engaged in relationships with believers. It's hard to really triumph higher than that on some levels. But
and last week you got a little hammock sleep time too. I mean, come on, throw that out there. You got a little blessed to sleep overnight in your hammock, which is that's like me eating a pizza, but that's your thing. Like, I get that. That's your
That's
your
my
safe
happy
space.
We got got a little camping. Weather was down into the upper 50s, and so that's right on.
That's
the range,
great weather.
Yeah. So I got to roll out from the hammock in the morning and just put my feet right down on the ground and see a beautiful sunrise.
And the best part about camping in this kind of weather is that morning fire for me, dude. That is the best part of this. But you mentioned the weather for church, like you guys. We have a little bit of people outside, and hey, here's the deal. I think in a year we've had 2 Sunday mornings interfered with by weather, and that's just of all the adversity we faced, it is remarkable how well we've been taken care of weather-wise. And that's something that we've talked about the leadership here several times and have been very thankful for.
Yeah. To Hal's question, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to encourage elopement, Hal. I don't know what you were doing, but I'm just going to, we're going to encourage that.
So we've got a couple of things we're going to think about. And in this context, because around it's the top of the hour, so we should get into the meat of things. One of the areas we're going to start with is what do we do with our own prior work, and how can we rework that into something valuable going forward? And I joke a lot about the awfulness of my prior work, but there's still some kernels of value there. And so for me, I think that's an important conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing what other folks may bring up. I think there's some good insight that can come from different perspectives there. The second thing we're going to look at is related to the first, but it's how to profit from others' work. Not so much commentaries or polished written endeavors, but outlines, sermons you may listen by others, Bible classes you may sit in, how to pick and choose from those things and transform the idea and own it, and then share it in a more healthy way or more pointed or specific way, which is a little bit different than just citing and saying someone has said, they said it here, and this is why it's good. There's a little bit of difference there. So Terry, do you make much reuse of your prior material in this way?
Well, I do, but it's funny when you sent the text to me this morning. I think you said how to look at our past sermons, and I said with regret and remorse, because look, now I'll say this too. At one time I don't know about you, Phil, but I had like 4 filing cabinets worth of old paper sermons with me. Those don't exist anymore. I trashed all those for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're really a pain to move. Okay. Number two, I never found myself taking the time to go find them, partly because my filing system was horrible. But now that everything is digital, I do keep all my old sermons digitally. And, it's amazing how well you can search through your old sermon files on your computer and how easily that is done, right? Yeah. So, I will always go back and look and see what I have done. It is amazing how many times I'll look at something that's maybe 10 to 12 years old, and I'll look at it and go, wow, that was a really bad sermon. Like that, I made some really dumb points in there. Or maybe how often I will go back and just look at years of sermons and realize how out of balance things were. I'll do that as well. But there is sometimes where I'll reuse at least the skeleton of an old outline because, for instance, if I'm asked to preach on divorce, I don't know how many outlines I have about that, but I'm going to pull all of those up, and I'm gonna at least read over them to see what I've said, and to see what value may be there. And it may be that I find there's no value to that. But it is a really good resource to start off with to see kind of where you're at. And the other reason I hold on to that stuff, by the way, Phil, is I may get asked to do a meeting somewhere on a specific topic, and at least that gives me a jump-off point. I don't have absolutely zero to go with. That doesn't mean I'm going to use any of it, right? I think that's the thing. But anyway.
Yeah, Mark Russell's comment, it's Marie Kondo for preachers. Does this sermon outline bring me joy? And if it doesn't, toss it out. I think there's some
I'm still going to keep that outline just to remind myself not what to say.
So I'll approach it from 3 steps. Step number 1 is what I did. Step number 2 is what I'm doing. And step number 3 is what I hope to do in the future. And this is what I did. What I did was pretty simple. I copied the behavior of the preachers that I knew. And they, like a lot of the guys who are commenting, had either quotes or comments given to them and says, you got to hold on to this. So I had 2 different things going to do that. I had an attempt to use the good all filing system, which was not good for all and was certainly not good for me. And that shifted into, I had a binder each year for any sermon that would be textual or topical in order of the year. And so from beginning of the year, end of the year. And a second binder that might be any expository series that I was doing at that time. And so the sermons would go in there. That's where they would live. The charts would go in there as well, because they were also stored in a little flapper thing that let you put them in the binders as well. And it was like a whole big binder system, not a wall.
The 3-inch binders everywhere. You had 3-inch binders
labels,
all over the place.
The whole label thing, all of that. And then it would just sit there. I had the digital files too, and it would just sit there.
By the way, that filing cabinet still has notebooks worth of class material that is organized kind of the same way.
Right. So then that shifted, and okay, well, I'm not really making good use of that afterwards, because I'd go back and I look at those charts, I look at those outlines, and I'm like, I really don't approach it that way. And then I realized that I wasn't really making good use of the paper outlines and the paper production process. And so I simply just said, that doesn't make sense, so let's stop that. But what I did accomplish was I started building records of my exposition of the text, good, bad, and ugly, and otherwise. And so everything that I did to break out a passage, and this kind of ties into Jared's comment about he makes use of his Bible class notes versus his old sermon notes, all of that went into documents attached to each book of the Bible. And so that is what I really made my repurposing zone. And citations, sources, details, verse by verse looks, all of that came into that box. And so I did that. Now going forward is kind of what I'm going to move to. About a year and a half ago, I shifted exclusively to producing all of my work inside of Logos, which means what I've been doing is taking all that textual exegesis from the bygone years, book by book, once, twice a week, sitting down there and saying, I'm going to take some of this and then put it into the note system. And all my sermons are inside Logos as well. And so they're now integrating with all the rest of my library. All the sources are being updated. And whenever I pull something that I need to use, it gets a higher degree of polished work for those classes, for those studies. And I make sure all the dots connect appropriately for everything that I can on the prep side, with the intention that, hey, I'll teach this again. I can open up Logos and 90% of it's right there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that about 2010, 2011, I stopped printing out sermons and started using an iPad back when the first one came out. And that changed all the storing system, by the way. Like, there was no more paper at that point, which was a good thing. But like you, now I'm not the nerd you are with Logos. I'm not even close. Let's be honest. But at least I'm slowly transitioning. I don't have the version to use the Good Sermon Planner like you have. But I am starting to transition into putting more notes into Logos, so that now going forward, the idea there is that you are able to then use all of that stuff from there, rather than pulling up your old outline. You just look at the notes that you found to be important for that text.
Yeah, let me sling a couple of comments tied together there real quick for Jared and Jeff. Jared Jacobs talks about how old the sermon outline is. Jeff Rear talks about, I'm going to expect all my sermons to be bad in the future. Some of it is perception, and some of it is practicality. So on the perception level, a sermon is a time capsule. It represents where you were spiritually, where the congregation was spiritually, and in absence of those two things, its value shifts. Like, it just doesn't have that same kind of sense of depth or connection or purpose. But here's another way to think about it in that same space. Every year, tons of people write spiritual songs. Thousands of them are written every year, tens of thousands perhaps. How many of them make it into a songbook, and then that songbook gets used and people love the song? Well, a very small percentage of them make it to the hymnal Super Bowl, if you will. So what's basically going on is most of your sermons are probably somewhere average or less. Like, they're average. They're your average. They're your competency level, maybe a little less, maybe a little higher. And like Jared points out, sometimes you're going to have one that's really good. And so that becomes the fodder, the groundwork for one that gets better as you mature as well. You'll look back on it and go, yeah, that's a good outline, good structure, but I really didn't go into depth. And when I approached this passage, I brought in a lot of stuff that didn't make sense to me then, and it still doesn't make sense to me now, so I'm not doing that anymore. And so you will mature and go, that was terrible, but so was I, because I was young. It's okay.
It's a maturity issue. Part of it's a maturity issue, and it's not meant to be negative. But at 25, there were things I just didn't understand yet that at 46 I do a little bit differently. But I'll also add into there that I think there's a little bit of it also reflects the influences around you, and somewhat I think I don't know how to explain this except for maybe cultural. That even within among preachers and among that academic realm, there comes to be kind of different hot button issues that may change the way you see things. So like one of the later kind of things for me, and sadly influenced by Phil and Jared, and I have to give them credit a little bit, is seeing more of the interconnectivity that 20 years ago, Phil, I don't think either one of us saw that as much. But that's become a more recent kind of push to see how those things interact, and there's been some more accessible work for us. So in 10 years, we're going to see things differently than we do now. And it may be that 10 years from now, there's something beyond some of the things we talk about now. And as you continue to add, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's very important to, as a preacher, you never stop studying, you never stop talking about things with friends and other people who can influence you. And groupthink and those kind of things are always important because they're helping you develop an understanding that is always increasing and always growing. So your sermons are going to reflect that. Everything goes back to the garden, Jared says. And look, here's the funny thing. In the last year, I regrettably find myself saying that a lot. Okay? But you're not going to go to a sermon from me 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago that thinks anything about things going back to the garden for me. And so my sermons are going to reflect that. And so if I pull up something from 10 years ago, it's not there. That's not as good to me. Now, who knows? 10 years from now, we may have abandoned everything goes back to the garden and everything points to the cross as the new catchphrase. And then that's going to be all over your sermons, right? Right. So part of that's just it's a reflection of kind of the time period that you find those sermons from, I think is another thing that's in there. That is unavoidable, and that's not wrong, by the way. That's just part of how it is.
And Jeff, I want to add a little bit of perception from my side. We talked about some of those perception issues. I want you to imagine your typical adult Bible class in the congregations you've grown up around spiritually, whether you were, as some would say, raised in the pew, or even more so maybe now as a new believer and then now a more mature believer. For the most part, those classes are taught by very well-intentioned individuals who are doing the best they can. Maybe they got handed a workbook. Maybe they've been plowing through the Gospel of John verse by verse for 6 years, all over the map. Not all of them were spectacular. And if we add that average, okay, so now you got a guy who's got a 60-hour-a-week job. Now he is also teaching that Bible class, and so he's spending 5-6 extra hours on that class, doing a really good job, the best he can. He hasn't been able to do what Paul talks about and what we may have the privilege to do, devote himself to the work. And so you're kind of balancing that in the context of all of that space. And so you look at it and go, it's average, but maybe average isn't that really good. It's not great. Now on the preacher level, you just started doing this work. You don't have the skills, the talents to kind of work through the text in a holistic way. And so your average might gradually rise, but it's still going to be average, because no matter how good you think you are, I'm going to tell you the truth, you're average.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you will hit a home run, and it'll most likely be because at that particular moment, the message you said was most needed for those who listened. You're not going to be hitting, 800 if you're talking about baseball. Like, it's just not going to happen. You're
Well,
in the 300s.
And that also gets into why some sermons aren't as good, is because you're at a different spot, a different church, a different group, a different kind of environment. I mean, all of that plays a role into that, which I think is really important. Which, by the way, I think one of the things to talk about is what do you do when you reuse an old sermon?
Right.
And I think, let me just throw this out there, and then you can answer, Phil. I think there's nothing wrong with retreading a sermon. Okay, we all do it, right? We all have sermons that we move and we reuse those sermons, maybe even a whole series of sermons. Maybe you preach the same sermon series at several different locations. That's something we all do. But as a general rule, here's my advice to you, especially young preachers. Do not ever pull out an old sermon without redoing that sermon. You should go through, and this is going to transition into what we're going to talk about using other people's stuff too. But when you take that old sermon, you don't just print it out and not look at it and just throw the PowerPoint up there. Mm-hmm. You need to go through that. You need to see if there's things you need to change, and I guarantee you there will be things that you need to change. Some of your illustrations won't be the same. Look, if I talk about maybe a personal illustration from 15 years ago, Peyton is 6 years old, Jillian's 2, and I don't have a Jameson at that point. Those things are different. Like things change. So something as simple as that, you've got to go through and redo your sermons. And by redo, I'll tell you that for me, that means I retype. I use manuscript format. I retype the sermon. I retype it completely. And that's my advice to anybody, is don't just print it off. Don't just find the file and reuse it. If you want to reuse an old sermon idea, go through the process of rethinking the entire thing.
Right, and here's the thing. This is a concept that's really a way to work through it. Your prior outline is in part a suggested recipe for the return to the text, but you still have to make the meal. You still have to get all the pieces together. Is to get, like Shane points out, all your thorough notes. Get those back out again. The stuff that you cut from the sermon, maybe there's some stuff that's value there. That's something important. And by the way, this is something I still do. When I make a sermon outline and then I connect it with visual media of any kind, everything is the same. I add designators to it. And so if it's not part of a textual series, then it's going to have the same numerical ordering at the beginning of the sermon. It's going to stay in the same folder. It's going to have the same titles. If there's part 1, 2, and 3, then there's going to be a part 1, 2, and 3 in the charts, because I don't want stuff getting lost like Shane talks about. I think that's something that's important for me. So when I'm going to repurpose something from the past, it usually occurs because, hey, I'm going to be working out of this text. Have I gone through this text before? Because I can't remember. And I've got a spreadsheet that tells me most of the sermons I've preached since I started preaching, what time it was, what the title was, what the text was. And so I go back to that and say, did I ever do anything with this? Look through all that. Okay, I did something with this. Pull it out. Most of the time, it's not going to fit precisely, but I'll open it up. I will read through my outline and say, are there parts of it that I can repurpose? And so I may pull out a bracket, a portion, bring it into the new document, connect it really quickly that way with my stuff. And I'll say, boom, that's part 1. And that creates the outline for the manuscript, which will make the message.
And you might find something from that sermon. You may not use anything from that sermon for your new sermon except an illustration or two, right? That may be the only thing you take from that. But the fact that you have the ability to go back and look at that gives you that ability. And, Shane, that's why I manuscript, is because I want to be able to pull up and see all of the things in there. And sometimes what's manuscript doesn't make it into the actual sermon, but that's the way I have all the things in one place for me. And that doesn't mean you have to do that. It's just, that's my process. Yeah. And like Phil said, it's got to match. You got to be able to find all that stuff. You got to be able to find it and see what you did.
I've got one bonus point that I've been doing lately. When I finish my sermon, and I preached it on Sunday, usually on Monday I will take a small part of that sermon, whatever it was, and rework it into a little bit longer than my typical Facebook post length, not full bulletin length, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs, and share that on Monday as a tie-in to the sermon. Even though it's basically the same idea, I'm writing it for a different audience. Now, I'm doing that to continue to make good use of that material and put those tie-ins together. It's good exhortation, it's good encouragement, it's good admonition, but it's skill building there. And so I'm repurposing that material one more step. Johnny Edwards used to say, make the most out of your material. It's stuck in my head, so I'm still doing it. I'm trying to write a sermon, it could be an article. And so I take a small portion of that sermon, and I did that on Monday with the sermon from Sunday. And I continue to try to do that. But let's stay on the table a little bit. A lot of us were given or even sought out sermon manuscript books. And it's like a little treasure trove when you're a young preacher in some ways. You're like, oh, I got all these ideas in here. Jerry, do you have a trove like that of like people give you these outlines, or you've cobbled together books and stuff like that?
So I had some outline books at one time. I think I've gotten rid of all of those. But in our day and age, look, it's not just, I think the outline book is a dead animal at this point. If you have those, you've just probably been given those. I mean, the majority of, so many people post their outlines on the internet that the internet has become your massive volume of outlines. And I guess we need to just break and talk a little bit before we go any further about plagiarism. And now, one of the things that I was taught, the way I was taught to outline in my internship, and the way I've taught other guys to outline, was to give them audio sermons of preachers and make them outline it to start off as their foundation. And then the key point was, you can't preach that sermon once you outline it. You can take that material, but you're going to have to reform that into your own actual sermon. And that may mean that you're going to say some things similarly, but you're not going to say the same things the same way. I'm a guy that's in the middle on plagiarism, so I'll just tell you straight up. If you're somebody out there and you hear one of my sermons, I don't care if you preach it word for word. It's going to sound weird if you call your kid Peyton and you don't have your kid named Peyton, but I'm just telling you, that doesn't bother me. There's a lot of guys that do. But here's the greater issue, whether it bothers somebody or not. If you're not taking the time to do your work, you're not glorifying God. And for me, that's the bigger issue. If you go out and just print off somebody's outline and get up and preach it, you're not doing the work, because that's not what the work looks like. And it is dishonest when you get up there and act like it's your own, unless you have permission. I got friends that we preach each other's stuff, and we have open permission, and we know that. But that's an arranged kind of marriage almost of sorts. Phil and I aren't in that arranged marriage, by the way, because Phil's stuff's too smart for me. I got to steal from dumb people. But plagiarism's a thing. So here's the deal. You go find somebody's outline, whether it's mine, it's Phil's, Shane Scott's, Mark Russell, some of those guys are on here. That's fine. But you need to treat that essentially like a commentary is the best probably advice. Take that sermon, take a couple of sermons, look at those, see how those things fit together. But you do your work and you come up with your own way. Because here's the other thing about this. You'll get busted if you don't do that. Because Phil and I, we're friends, but we don't talk the same way. We don't use the same words. We don't use the same ideas. Mark Russell and Shane Scott and I are friends, but we don't say the same things. We don't think the same way. We don't use the same words. You have a style that is all your own. And the reality is, if you get up and preach somebody else's material with their words and it doesn't fit you, people will know. Okay? So the best advice is, you can use stuff as commentary, as kind of additional info, but you got to write your own sermon. That's what the work is. Like, that's your job. Do your job. Don't use this stuff as a way to get out of doing your job.
Yeah, and let me make a basket of comments. I want to respond to James Miller at the end with about executable outlines because I know Mark pretty well, and I think there's some good value to his work, but I think it hasn't been used ethically at times. Um, so, in profiting from other folks' stuff, part of it depends on context and like where I'm going to be using it. If I'm conversationally referring to, hey, this guy said, that guy said, I'll do my very best to point someone to where it came from.
Right.
If I'm publishing, if I'm going to put this on the internet somewhere, I'm going to do my very best at that point to specifically cite my source. I'm going to point people to where they can purchase the thing that I'm quoting from, very much like you would do in an academic setting or a school setting. And that includes publishing, includes preaching. I view them the same. If I'm going to get up and speak and I'm going to reference a thing. By the way, Terry's low-key plan is actually so that all preachers will name their kids the same as his kids so they can just use his sermons. That solves the problem. So I slip that in there. I think it's really important to do that. It builds the skill, though, to like grapple with someone else's work, deal with it appropriately, and profit in the right context from it. And so if I'm going to put something publicly out, I'm going to cite where it came from. That includes visual media work. If I don't own it, I'm going to cite its location, like where it came from. And so that's just how I approach those things. I think there's some good ethical reasons to do so.
Well, and Hal Hammonds brings up kind of the journalism student, him chafes at the idea of acting like someone else's outline or illustration is original to me. And I get that. Like, I think that one of the things is it's very easy to say, it's different. You maybe that you say about an illustration, I heard this story, right? And it is a story you heard. But it may be that I know this story is Phil. And it may be that I say, it's like my buddy Phil Martin tells the story and go on and share the story. There's nothing wrong with that. Sunday I preached a lesson that was loosely based off of a book. So in the introduction I say, this idea comes from this book by this author.
Yeah.
So that that's the original thought for this. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Where you get in trouble is where, you act like you came up with that idea of the book, and then somebody comes back and says, well, I've read that book, and then all of a sudden you look like a fool. It's got to be cautious about that.
So with executable outlines and Mark's work there, I've known Mark's family for a long time. His brother used to assemble with us out in Oregon. Great people. Mark has done, probably has one of the most widely traveled evangelistically angled websites among Christians that I know. Back when I was really active in that regard, he was one of the top three constantly.
He's like the OG of Church of Christ websites, isn't he? Like, I mean, think about it. He goes way back.
Yeah, I think
that thing's been around a long time.
My URL for Gospel Defender is older than his, but his existed in the discussion groups well before mine did.
Well, and quite frankly, nobody cared about your Gospel Defender. So
it was popular.
It doesn't exist
anymore. It was popular in the overseas work there.
I'm just kidding about that. The executable outlines, though, has been around for a long time and been well respected, and for good reason. I think, look, there's people who make fun of that, right? I think Mark should be praised for his work.
Right. Mark's work is good. The issue that folks have with it is the idea that you can pull off one of his outlines, stand up and preach it, and never refer to Mark's work and take the credit as your own. And that happens a lot.
And Mark gives permission for that to happen.
Right.
And I think one of the things to be said to people who have a problem with that is Mark doesn't have a problem with that.
Right. So here's the balance, though. You can use Mark's wonderful work that represents his personal insight into the scriptures. At times, you may agree or disagree with it. But do the same thing that you would with anything else. Give him the credit there, too, is my encouragement to you. And there are two reasons to do it. One, it prevents you from using his good work like a crutch. That's a great method of prevention. But also, Mark's got a lot of good stuff there that someone else might want to read. So
Yeah.
let them know it. Let people grapple with it. If you do your work after using one of his outlines as a starting point, this is not his Bible class workbooks. It's a different thing. Then everybody profits. You're better. They're better. Mark's work goes further. That's all good.
Yeah.
This is a point where someone may post the video that I jokingly put together about Mark's website, which is accurate. I 100% support it. I think it's the appropriate response. But
and I also, by the way, think something needs to be thrown out there too. Like, there are some guys out there who are preaching, who are working full-time jobs in addition to preaching, that have a little bit different stress level than some of us who've been blessed to do this work full-time and be fully supported. And I think there's got to be a little bit of mercy in those kind of standpoints. What you get up and hear a guy preach one of Mark's outlines and you want to crucify him, but you find out that he's worked 60 hours as a nurse on a COVID floor and he barely was able to get up and preach that week. That was the best he could do. Give some mercy about that, okay? Let's be honest about that. And I think that's just one of those things where we've got to be careful how judgmental we are about some of this stuff. But as a general rule, it goes back to what I said earlier. Do your job. That's the thing. And if you get up and preach somebody else's outline, the question I'm going to have is, what have you been doing all week? Have you been fishing? Have you been hunting? Have you been camping and not doing your work? Are you playing video games? Why aren't you doing your job? Because that is your job if you're a full-time worker, for sure.
Right, and that's the shift in context. When I'm being critical of the process, it's for those who have devoted themselves to the work and are being supported to do the work. If you're in what we consider bivocational or not even supported at all to do the work, it should be treated in a different way, but it's still equally fair to report the origin of your work. Let people know, hey, this is what I'm doing. Nothing's wrong. The message is still good. It's probably even better at that point because you're building integrity into the message too.
Phil, Hal has a question. I want to throw this out there to you. Is there a rationalization for stealing someone's outline that glorifies God? Is there one that is not designed to attract glory to yourself?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there is one.
Let me tell you this. I will tell you this. I remember when we started preaching, this has been close to 25 years ago, you and I, ballpark range. There was a different mentality back then than there is now about this, by the way. I know, and probably you too, Phil, have asked somebody, can I have your outline? Or do you mind if I preach that? And 25 years ago when I was starting off, if I asked almost 95% of the time, if I asked a preacher for their outline, they would give me the outline out of their Bible. Mm-hmm. That happened on more than one occasion. And there was also occasions where I would ask that preacher, maybe in a gospel meeting, maybe I was visiting or whatever, would you mind if I preached that same idea? And more than once, and more than one guy said, there is no copyright on the gospel.
Right.
Okay. And I do think, and you mentioned the outline books. Years ago, preachers made outline books, not really to make money, but because they got tired of copying sermons for people. Like that's really the motivation behind that. And in fact, if you talk to the best guys, you'll find out if you talk to the best Bible class material teachers, the reason they sell their Bible class material is they got tired of making copies for folks, and that was the easiest way. Because you don't get rich off of that stuff, by the way. I don't know if you know that. If you want to make money, don't write Bible class material. It doesn't work that way. Okay? You sell Bible class material just because you don't want to run a copier anymore. That's usually the reasoning. So all I will say is the idea of stealing someone's outline is kind of, to me, a more modern construct that is tied largely to the internet. And I think one of the things, I'm gonna say something that's kind of harsh, but if you're one of those guys that takes that personally, don't post your outlines on the internet. Just don't, and then nobody can take them. Yeah. And that's not meant to be ugly. I'm just saying, if you have a problem with that, don't put the temptation out there. And the other guys, don't steal. Like, don't steal. If you do, ask permission to take. I do think, though, stealing and being given are two different things. In all the cases I referenced, there was permission granted rather than taken without permission. And I do think what we're talking about is the ethical thing to do in this case.
Yeah, and so going back through Hal's thing, over the years, I had many of those same experiences with Terry. Someone would preach something somewhere. I'm like, hey, man, you got an outline for that? That was awesome. I love the way you put that together. The context was different because it was not an internet. That sermon was most likely never going to be preached in that local context. And the only caveats that I ever received were, please don't use it in meetings. That was the only caveat that I was ever given whenever I went to someone and say, hey, I love that lesson. I'd love to preach something like it. And outlines, for the most part, everyone was using outlines in the context of people I was around. They were not manuscripts. And so they were just a simple structure of ideas. 2-3 pages of thought flows was the outline concept that I was surrounded with. And so what you were sharing were your rationale to process through a text, not the words you actually spoke. Two different things. The rise of the internet has changed that. It's also, on a personal level, one of the reasons why I stopped posting my PowerPoint charts online. That was my personal decision of that because I got annoyed at the way it was used a couple times. I said, I don't have to do that anymore. It was part of the factors that precipitated my change in my dropping of my website. Family issues and needing to be dad was the primary one. I need to stop spending time on it and just be dad.
Look, and I'm going to slip into that little bit, kind of the curmudgeon on the other side of this thing. One of the reasons I think that we've got to be very careful for preachers, one of our temptations can be pride if we're not careful. And if you're upset about plagiarism, make sure it's because you're upset because the guy's not being ethical, not because it's your sermon and how dare he steal your Mona Lisa. Like, I think that's one of the things that's a big issue here. And you know, at the end of the day, I don't care if somebody takes my PowerPoint. We don't post PowerPoints now either, just because everything's video at this point. And but for at the end of the day, for me, I don't care if you take one of my sermons because I don't think I own that anyway, kind of thing. But the greater issue comes into play goes back to just the ethical responsibility to do your job. You have a responsibility to do your job. And if you're taking stuff from other people, you're not doing your job, okay? And if you want to do that, at least contact that person and say, hey, I love your PowerPoint here. Contact Phil. Where did you get this? It may be, by the way, as is the case with a lot of my PowerPoint, it's a service I paid for and it's illegal for you to take. And you need to pay the fee yourself. Okay? So there's a lot of other factors in here that you may not consider that you've got to consider in that sense.
Yeah. And look, you may have put a ton of time building it together. All those things are factors, and so you get to choose what you do with your stuff. And if you want your stuff to be used in all kinds of different ways, super awesome, great, go do that.
Post away.
It's one of the reasons why when I shifted my process, I kind of planned it that way, and I'm not comfortable with it because sometimes the stuff I was using was also given to me. And then I had the ethical opportunity to share that with a third party. Like all that stuff I had to process through it.
If you want to use good presentation material stuff, you've got access to Canva too. I'm just going to throw that out there. It's free. There's no excuse today, especially in the PowerPoint realm, for you not having good stuff on your own. Like, go out there and again, do the work. Like I think that's the thing for me is this whole thing revolves around. These are aids. These are materials. The other people's outlines, they're like the books on my shelf behind me, right? They're resources for me, but they're not my work that I get to present as my own.
Yeah, and I think I'll piggyback to Jared's comment, and he says it's easy not to get upset about someone stealing your Mona Lisa of a sermon if you don't have a Mona Lisa. You see, Jared, once you accept the fact that all your sermons are trash, it's okay. And it's good to know that Jared's in that space, that's where he's at right now, that all of his sermons are bad. And so if people take his stuff, it's not a big problem.
Yeah. I love you, Jared. I'm not going to be mean to you. Plus, you just set your powerlifting record not too long ago, so we're all excited.
I'm not really worried.
He's stronger than me. I'm scared of Jared. By the way, Jared's Mona Lisa is his classes. Like, if you were to steal something from Jared that would make him upset, it would be his class material. Let's be honest.
Yeah, that would be accurate. Having sat in both of those environments. So that's kind of like some things to think about. I want to get one more practical level. All of those old sermon outline books, all that old stuff that you have, there's value to someone in them. It may not be valuable to you right now, but repurpose them in some way. Give them to somebody else. Give some good instruction on how to use them. Give them some process tips to say, hey, look, there's some great seeds of ideas in here. But don't think they replace the work that you need to do. I think that's it.
Jared, did you see that comment by Jared?
I just did.
By the way, I got to tell you, if you want to feel good about yourself, don't be friends with salts. I'm just going to throw that out there. That's just, or if you want to be liked, because last week in a Bible class about Samson, I became the enemy because I've been influenced by salts too much.
Yeah, it just is what it is.
It is what it is.
Yeah. So get some good value out of them. Tell people there's good seeds in there. Use them as a planting opportunity, not the finished product. I think that's something that really needs to be driven home in this, how to use other people's stuff, their outlines, their classes. These should be seeds. Very likely they've edited them before they produced them anyway. There's a whole lot more in the backdrop to that before it makes it to the page.
Phil, part of this, by the way, is this little kind of, it's related. It's not the sole focus of this, but you need to develop your own style of preaching. Because the other thing is, if you're constantly mimicking everybody else, you don't have a style. You're just an imitator. You're an impersonator at that point. You as a preacher need to have your own style, the way you say things, the vocabulary you use. Look, Jared's going to mention things I'm never going to mention because I'm not that smart, okay? And for me to pretend to be that smart, if you ever hear me quote anything from the Hebrew or Greek, you're going to always hear me say something like, I don't know any languages, but I've been told. That's what you're going to hear me say. And you're going to hear Jared go, well, the Hebrew word for here could mean, and you're going to fall asleep. So in the process of that, I'm just saying, you've got to develop your own style and know what your style is, because that plays a role in being able to actually do your work and not steal other people's stuff.
Right. And by the way, Jared falls asleep in his own classes, especially if they're online. So.
Oh, yeah, it's terrible.
Yawning all the time. Any last comments, Terry, before we close out for today? I know we've had some excellent questions and comments from the Peanut Gallery, speaking specifically of Jared as being the peanut part of the gallery, and all the other folks are giant and huge.
Hey, great discussion. Really enjoyed people's involvement. And just want to throw this out there, man, we've been doing this a couple of years now, so, we're not running out of ideas, but most of them at the point are feels really bad ideas. So if you have something you would like for us to talk about, send us a message and we'll discuss. But yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and by the way, that just basically defines all of my ideas. They all fall in
they're terrible.
How bad?
They're bad. They're bad. Terrible.
Worse
than assaults class.
I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to encourage you in your work as an evangelist. If there's things that we can do to strengthen your spiritual condition, if we can help you individually, if there's something gospel related that we can be connected to, we're happy to help. Everyone take care, and may God bless you. We are